Title of my presentation, The Non-Human Iconography of Climate Change, From Distant Empathy to More Than Human Entanglements. We did not plan that, I promise. Perfect. So when we think about climate change and iconography, the non-human iconography, we usually don't think about reptiles or amphibians, right? So the climate change, emblematic species, the barometers of climate change are usually not those, even though reptiles, in this case, the neotropical terrestrial reptiles, are particularly vulnerable. And this is something that is not featured in correctly or sufficiently in species extinction risk. So what you and I probably think about when we hear the word climate change iconography, the emblematic species are, of course, the polar bears, right? These species, it's our poster child species when we think about climate change. And we've all seen those images of polar bears adrift on some melting ice block somewhere in distress. Of course, this is problematic. There's a wonderful piece that came out recently by Dorothea Born. She's in Science and Technology Studies at the University of Vienna, analyzing 20 years of pictures in the National Geographic that has polar bears as this embodiment, or species embodiment of climate change. And what Born and her colleagues find over those 20 years is a so-called anthropomorphization of the polar bears. And they appear showing almost human behaviors and displaying emotions from the early family idyllary setting with the cubs to the later bears in danger. And that, of course, allows the reader to identify and emotionally relate to those species in a way that we can't do or are not willing to do with reptiles. And of course, that goes back to the teddy bear, especially in the US, first one introduced in 1903. There's been quite a lot of work on the polar bears, and Kate Manso already almost 10 years ago pointed out that the polar bears trigger in us, or in many of us, empathy, but they don't necessarily allow an understanding of climate change. So they're limited in that regard. Moreover, they actually obscure, make invisible the systemic injustices that are built into climate change and impacts of climate change. They're very individualized, and they portray a far away in distant places vulnerability where people are mostly absent. They depoliticize climate change, and they absolutely obscure the larger drivers, capitalism, the major one, that make climate change actually a climate emergency. And also they make it exceedingly difficult to imagine radical and fundamental changes in the way we live. This disconnect, this gap, admittedly, gets a little shorter or smaller when we see those images. We saw them in February 2019, coming out particularly of Siberia, where we find polar bears in areas that are very close to us, or at least the people who live there and their homes, where polar bears actually enter spaces where we don't want to see them, sometimes exhausted, sometimes dangerous. So what the polar bears and other distant climate icons, like the penguins, don't do for us is the following. They actually offer very limited recognition of relations with these others, right? We're too far away from them. We may feel sorry, it doesn't really hurt us ourselves. They also offer only a narrow basis for responsible action. If we don't feel it, well, how can we possibly act? And they offer no inspiration for meaningful ways of being together. We're too far apart. Now, how do we get to such meaningful and responsible interaction? How do we do it? How do we think about relational impacts? So Gerda Relving, who is here in Sydney, a human geographer, has said the following. What we need to be able to focus on particular subjective experiences that create opportunities for us as humans to swerve, to change our direction, to bear witness. And it is this joint, communal, mutual vulnerability when one comes to see their life as intertwined with the environment that might prompt an affective swerve. And this is what we want. This is what we want to get at. An act of environmental justice witnessing. So when do those experiences happen? And I'm going to argue that the angry or angriest summer of 2019 here in Australia was just such a moment. A moment to have those experiences. In the East, I live in Perth, so we didn't feel it that much, but the heat wave here, and of course the Queensland floods. So several of you may remember many, many records here broken. Record in terms of temperature, high temperature, the one that I find scariest is out of Queensland, over 40 days of over 40 degrees Celsius in a row. That is stunning. And the Queensland floods with more than the annual rainfall within just 10 days. So what does that mean? So we have these records. We want to think about relational impacts. We want to think about extreme events. We want to act together. We want to think about climate justice. But it's difficult. Again, Gerda says here, how do we get from an abstract ontological revisioning, that reorientation Lauren has been talking about, to glimmer or a whiff of what to do on the ground? How do we do it differently? No answers arrive easily in our heads when we ponder this question, just a spacious silence and a slowing down. Now, maybe that summer, that angry summer, is, again, such a glimmer, an opening for learning, a becoming other, creating connections and encountering possibilities that render us newly constituted beings in a newly constituted world. If you've looked at the newspapers, if you've looked at the various blogs and Twitter testimonies, these are the images we saw, again, January, February. 500,000 cattle that drowned in Queensland, but also tons of people rescuing animals. And every person who rescues an animal is probably a good person. That's where we ought to be. Tons of witness statements. Shocking animal death, also because of the heat wave. Lots of feral horses that died. Thousands of flying foxes that fell out of the trees, also here in Sydney. The mass fish death in the Murray-Darling basin, but also, again, many people who posted pictures on the web of taking care of their animals, the easiest ones, putting their dogs into water. But, these actually really surprising pictures of people carrying their dogs over the streets because the pavement was too hot for the dogs to walk on. So relational impact, it's not just the humans, it's also the animals affected, but also images of desperate animals trying to come closer to our human spaces, to find water, to find shelter, to find shade. I think the outrage was about the one koala drowning in the swimming pool and recommendations for floating devices that people should have in their swimming pools just in case that koalas would come close and seek water. Snakes in our showers and toilets, because this was the area where water was left. So animals in spaces where we usually don't see them. And then, of course, these relational impacts, not about us trying to seek to stay cool, and this is somewhere during Melbourne, the tennis tournament, but also, again, many, many pictures online about people caring about their animals or animals that appeared all of a sudden in their backyards. I think the one that I find most amazing, this is the seagull watchdog out in Sydney that had protective little shoes on because, again, it was too hot for the animal to walk. Now, these are moments that are not normal. This is not how it should be. And maybe these are the moments that make us rethink and reorient ourselves to say there is some responsibility on which we have to take action. A couple of years ago, I love visuals, I like things, I created this wonderful figure with my colleague Nancy Tuana about relational ontologies of harm and flourishing, not quite knowing that I could use it today in this presentation, because that's exactly what I think is happening. So this relational ontology between harm and flourishing, we call it a relational ontology and socio-natural security. Not just an economic security to protect us from climate change, but a way to think about the world as a three-dimensional space in which the humans are no longer at the center. So we have the close ones, or others, the distant others, maybe these are the non-humans or future generations, and the sociant and natural coming together in an understanding of corporeal vulnerability and situated resilience. So how do we do this? And why are the events, as we saw them in January and February, a good example to reorient ourselves? They are, because they allow us to challenge anthropocentrism, right? The dismantling or the decentering of human species exceptionalism. We are not special. We are not the only ones around. Like Val Plumwood told us 10 years ago, we need to think and imagine alternatives, move beyond the hyper-separated categories of the human and the nature and cultural on two extremes of the pole. And this is important when we think about adaptation. These moments are useful because they allow us to embrace relational ontologies. Several human geographers who've spoken to this topic for a while. The more than human geographies, understanding that humans are no longer the only beings that count. They are part of a messy heterogeneity of being in the world. And this is what allows us to tackle humans in everyday spaces, in the city, for example. These moments, January and February, allow us to recognize coexistence and codependence, and maybe most importantly, they allow us to learn to be affected. And this is again drawing upon Bruno Latour, learning from others, learning to be with others, collectively learning to be affected actually opens up more diverse worlds with new possibilities for action. Right? Incredible opportunities, nonetheless sad, but this is maybe where we have to start. Of course, these recognitions, these ways of orienting or reorienting ourselves, they're not new. I want to draw upon two examples. One, of course, is Dorian Massey, a Marxist geographer, sadly no longer with us, who has introduced this wonderful word to us, thrown togetherness. So Dorian Massey has talked a lot about place and space, about meeting places, about networks of connections, about progressive, relational, outward-looking, thrown togetherness. And she says, what is special about place is not some romance of a pre-given collective identity or the eternity of the hills. Rather, what is special about place is precisely that thrown togetherness, the unavoidable challenge of negotiating a here and now, and a negotiation which must take place within and between both human and non-human. So we can draw on that. But even more importantly, and here we have Donna Haraway, and thanks to Lauren again, who allows us to think about becoming with, being with, co-becoming, becoming with. And Haraway, in her book 10 years ago, When Species Meet, already talks about co-becoming or becoming with, that human responsibility in relationship with companion animals. Acting out of responsibility and respect. But even more importantly, in her 2016 book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin with the Thulucene, or Cthulhucene, she says Thulucene, allows us to think about this way we're all intertwined, worldlings on this place. And the way she argues is, well, staying with the trouble, of course, is to first think about animals, critters, who cannot easily adapt their way out of the climate emergency. They have to stay with the trouble. And maybe it is our now opportunity and responsibility to understand with whom we're connected, who we're bound up with, and what our responsibilities are to make sure that those who stay with the trouble actually have a chance to survive. And this is through an understanding of entanglements. These two papers here have picked up on Haraway's understanding of entanglements and staying with the trouble. Fantastic pieces, geography pieces, urban planning pieces. So do look up what's in there. And I'm going to just highlight some important elements that we can use. The first that comes out of this new literature on more than human geographies, particularly in cities, uses the term climate cosmopolitics. And that's work by Donna Houston and colleagues drawing upon a philosopher, a Belgian philosopher, by the name of Isabelle Stengers. So cosmopolitics is understood as a general political entanglement with the cosmos. It includes not just the human citizenry, but all actors, and honors the intangible, experiences, emotions, beliefs, and practices, where diverse stories, perspectives, and practices can connect to create the foundation for new strategic possibilities. Entanglements, we mean here bodily encounters beyond the body, out into the multi-species world. Multi-species entanglements based on a way of thinking, but connectivity, connectedness. Again, coming back to Plumwood's idea of overcoming the hyper-separation. And when we think about connectivity, and we think about the flying foxes and the thousands of flying foxes that fell out of the trees, we're not just thinking, oh, these poor babies falling out of the trees. We're thinking about how we are connected to them. And you may know that the flying foxes, especially those in Sydney, the gray-headed flying foxes, are pollinators, just like the bees. And we need them. So this is one way to think about connectivity and entanglement and the ways we are bound up, not maybe with all species simultaneously, that's too overwhelming, but with some, as Haraway tells us to think. So an ethics of connection, an ethics of making visible these everyday encounters that otherwise may disappear. The second one, and this is work by Wendy Steele and colleagues, 2019, so very new, brand new, introduces us to that concept of empathetic imaginings. It's based on the notion of entangled empathy that Laurie Gruen has introduced to us. Philosopher, she works in animal studies, Wesleyan University. Entangled empathy, something we think when we want to improve human-animal relations by attending to another's well-beings. It allows us to think about multiple and mutual relations, about multiple and mutual needs, interests, desires, vulnerabilities, hopes, and sensitivities. And maybe this is what we're thinking about when we look at the term transformative and transformational adaptation, because it shows us meaningful ways of being together. And the last one that comes out of Wendy's and colleagues' stories here is maybe the one I find most interesting. And again, it relates to Lauren's presentation. You may remember that Lauren talked about outcasts. There's another way of framing it, and it's called stray ethics. So the image of the stray when we think about dogs, dingoes, one of you works on dingoes, foxes, wolves, the fringe dwellers, the outcasts, right? The unwanted, the homeless, the outsiders. So these are the ones that Barbara Creed, in her work on stray and stray ethics, talks about as a lens through which to consider the future of the planet and the lives of all living, not just those that we think are the outcasts. And of course, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to understand that these strays are also human strays, precisely those that you saw in Lauren's PowerPoint. The homeless, the refugees, the unwanted, the invisible actors within an urban fabric. And Creed argues that climate change, the loss of home and habitat, applies not just to citizens at the urban fringe, but of course those who live in low island states, all endemic species and neglected urban companion animals. And we, as the humans, very much on top of the hierarchy, are of course not immune, and the danger of becoming a stray is in us at this very moment. At the same time, understanding stray ethics should be a motivation for empathy, recognition, for acting out together, because we are all in it together, and hence it also puts emphasis on the agency in all strays, the snakes who show up in our toilets included. Okay? So stray ethics as a way to reorient our thinking. I'm going to end here with a recognition of the first animal extinct because of climate change. A little rat-like rodent native to Australia, the Bramble K. mellimus, died because of sea level rise in one of the islands in the Torres Strait. So, conclusion. Following advice from Wendy Steele, yes, let's think about human and non-human strays, but let's recognize difference, but more importantly, let's recognize what we have in common. Limits to adaptation, looming loss of habitat, lives, livelihoods, way of living, and let's empathize, let's grieve for what we have collectively or individually lost and are likely to lose. And maybe this allows us a new understanding and practices of living in more than human worlds. If this entangled empathy is motivating, if we are able to learn to be affected and overcome ontological boundaries, and if shared vulnerability is the driving force of connection, as witnessed in the angriest of angry summers, and we can imagine and practice more meaningful and responsible ways of being together, in place, in the world, then, I would argue, we are ready to shift conceptually and bodily from an ethics of justice and a politics of resistance, this is where the discourse sits now, to an ethics of empathy, a politics of affirmation, as Gerda Relwick calls it. Perhaps this, then, is the motivation for relational transformation, not just societal transformation. My colleague Karen O'Brien talks a lot about the personal, technical, and political sphere, but the more than human transformation for multiple species justice. Thank you.